20 years ago today, Tony Blair became the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom with an absolutely humongous parliamentary majority after what can only be described as a completely brilliant campaign, full of optimism, full of this new idea that had been cooked up by Blair, Campbell and Mandelson of the third way. New politics, new Britain. This is what it sounded like. I remember Neil Kinnock dancing to this, John Prescott jigging around. I mean, it was so brilliant, I almost believed it myself. Things can only get better. And that next morning, in Downing Street, the sun was shining. And for those of you not old enough to remember this, I've never seen anything like it before in British politics, and I doubt we'll ever see anything like it again. He was greeted by the crowds and by the media. It was almost as if it was the second coming of the Lord. This was Blair today responding to that bright sunny morning.
I was surprised by it, yeah, but on the other hand, it had become pretty clear during the course of the campaign that we were very likely to win, but we'd lost 4 elections and we've been out of power for almost 2 decades. I was so keen that we were not complacent that I virtually obliterated, even from my own mind, the prospect of how large the majority would be.
So it was brand new politics. It wasn't left-wing, it wasn't right-wing. It was in many ways a response to the fact that socialism was seen to have failed and that actually many of the doctrines of Thatcher had now become part of the mainstream debate in British politics, and effectively Blair went with them. So suddenly the Labour Party was not perceived to be a threat to business, and there was what was known as the prawn cocktail offensive, where Gordon Brown and others went round city boardrooms and business boardrooms promising, we will, as a Labour Party, not put up tax, so nothing to be scared of. And of course the Tories had been in power for 18 years, and to be frank, John Major's party was split down the middle over the question of Europe. We saw the emergence in that time of Jimmy Goldsmith Referendum Party, of UKIP. The party was in real trouble. But it was only a few years in to Blair's term when we had the really dramatic, horrendous events of 9/11. And I think it was the response to 9/11 in many ways that I think has shaped, at least I believe has shaped, perhaps our dominant long-term view of who Tony Blair is. Here's Blair talking about extremism.
I saw this Islamist threat from, I think, quite an early stage and believed it was much more profound than we thought. And so when 9/11 happened, which at the time was an event that didn't just shock the world, it traumatized it. And I saw that as the culmination of a process that had built up over time and a huge, but you can't go back and, take a different decision and see how it would have turned out.
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons.
I mean, the problem with all of that is that, what you were saying turned out to be wrong, didn't it?
Yeah, and, there's never enough times that you can apologise for the intelligence being wrong, but that was the intelligence we were given, and we were given it, by the way, for a very simple reason. He was the one leader in the world who'd actually used WMD since the Second World War.
I sensed, during that part of the interview, that Blair was very much on the back foot and indeed looked pretty shifty. He knows himself, and he must hate it, but he knows himself that the one issue that defines him in the minds of the British public is that decision to go to war in Iraq. Not, of course, that the British people are pacifists. In fact, far from it. We're perfectly happy to intervene militarily. We just want to be told the truth about why we're doing it. And I think there's a feeling that whilst he says the intelligence was wrong, I think there's a feeling that actually it was Campbell, the dodgy dossier, that they basically cooked the books to try and persuade Parliament to vote the way that they did. But that's a bad memory, but there'll be many listening to this show tonight who will have some good memories of Tony Blair, of some of the changes that he made, and, difficult not to say that British society didn't change. Blair had some very proud moments through this, and he was indeed, one of his big things was that he wanted us to change the way we managed immigration in this country. We had, since the early 1950s, until Blair got elected, run pretty consistently with net migration running at 30,000 people a year. It had been that for about 50 years. But Blair thought it was time to open Britain up. He thought we needed more people. He thought we needed more young people. He thought, actually, that the diversity in society would be a good thing. I mean, they even boasted, New Labour, about rubbing the noses of the right in diversity. And I think this is another controversial thing, but one that he still today believes has been an absolutely massive success. Here he is on that subject.
I do think we underestimated the numbers of people, but it was a completely different situation in 2004. And by the way, never forget, this is what's so extraordinary to me about this current situation. Enlargement of the European Union, bringing Eastern Europe into Europe, was a huge positive thing.
Well, Blair, completely unapologetic about all of that. But there are other things, other changes in society that Blair, and perhaps again, Adam Bolton from Sky News had him a bit on the back foot on immigration. But here's Blair on the front foot, talking about his proudest achievements as Prime Minister.
Obviously, there's things like there's lots of different things. I mean, I think you could talk about the changes we made socially in terms of attitudes to race, to women's equality, to gay rights. Obviously, there's things like the Good Friday Agreement that we've talked about. You know, I think we did make big improvements. I mean, if you take the satisfaction ratings when we left office in the health service, you know, we did turn the health service around, which is why it's such a tragedy it's in the state it is today. I'm very proud of what we did on overseas aid. I mean, we didn't just treble aid. We brought in program, we created the Department of International Development.
And in fact, many of the things that Blair did and Blair was proudest of, in fact, David Cameron did continue. Of that, there's no question. So did he make the country a better or worse place? And, you know, if you think that Blair was actually a massive, transformative figure in this country that modernised our society, that opened it up, then do call me on 0345 6060 973. If you think he was a disaster and he broke down trust between people and politicians, text at 84850. And as ever, you can tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. I'm going to go to Anthony in Watford as my first caller of the evening. Anthony, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel.
Blair a good thing or a bad thing?
Best thing that's ever happened to this country.
Oh, wow. OK. Go on, please.
I'm a Thatcherite from the top of my head to the bottom of my toes.
Yes.
I spoke to you some weeks ago. I'm a staunch Remainer.
Yes.
Thank God, Tony, thank God he's coming back into the ring. You've done more damage to this country, I said to you some weeks ago, than Oliver Cromwell. Your words, not mine. The EEC is a fantastic idea gone wrong. Our last generation gave their lives for a free Europe. Now's not the time to turn it back on Europe.
Yes, they did, Anthony. They gave it for a free democratic Europe of independent nation-states that couldn't be dominated by anybody big.
But I'm 48% of the country that want to remain. I'm even trying to say in public I'm a Remainer. Oh, you're a moaner, are you? That's insulting. I've got a view. I've got an opinion. I love my country. Tony Benn, get back in there. Tony Blair, get back in there.
If you love your country, Anthony...
I do.
Why do you want it to be governed by somebody else?
I think there's only... Strength is unity. And the EC, I think, is a fantastic idea. It's got some problems. I'll give you that. Nigel, get back in there and do the best you can for Europe. Get the best you can for my country. I've got nothing wrong with asking people to know, what do you want to come to our country for? Holiday? Fine. I'm sorry, you've got a prison record. You're not allowed in our country. There's nothing wrong with border controls. Nothing wrong with that at all. But there's going to be... We've jumped off the cliff and we're now starting to understand.
You and I don't agree on that. But let's get back to Blair. You know, and you've said he was one of the best things that ever happened to this country. So Blair, he did make it pretty clear today that he's closing down all his business interests. And boy, he's had a pretty good run for the last 10 years, according to all financial accounts. He's going to get back in politics. He said he wouldn't stand in this general election. So I wonder, Anthony, if Blair was poised and waiting for Corbyn to have a very bad election, and then either to try and take on the leadership of the Labour Party or perhaps to sort of do a modern-day Roy Jenkins. And because one of the things he bemoaned today was that the centre wasn't holding, and that the politics of right and left was growing. So maybe what he's thinking is he'll do what Roy Jenkins did all those years ago and set up a new form of SDP. Would you welcome Blair coming back to lead a political party in Britain?
Right, yes, I would.
Right.
I'll tell you why, because you'll give the general public a chance to think of what they're doing. Why haven't we got a choice to think if it's the right thing? If the country say, look, it's definitely the right thing, we've got to get out, fine, I'll shut up. But we've been told lies and lies and lies. We haven't been told the truth.
We've had 50 years of lies, Anthony. We were told it was a common market, and they've lied to us ever since. Anthony, listen, we're not going to agree on that point, but you think Blair should come back. It's very, very interesting. Freddie in Chelmsford, Blair, a good thing or bad thing? Is the country better or worse?
A bad thing, Nigel. A very much a bad thing. Mm-hmm. When he was elected, we'd had 18 years of John Major and previous to him, Margaret Thatcher.
Yep.
My dad and I used to sit down the pub saying how terrible they were, and we were desperate for a Labour Party, a Labour government. And he came along, and I thought, this guy looks wonderful. And then he won the election overwhelmingly, and as the years rolled by, he did nothing for working people. I was Labour all my life, and he single-handedly destroyed my faith in the Labour Party, him alone. And when he was going on and on about weapons of mass destruction, I'm just an ordinary guy on the street, but I thought, he's talking a load of rubbish, absolute rubbish. And sure enough, it turned out to be a load of rubbish. I'm nobody, nothing.
Funny, Freddie, wasn't it? A lot of, as you put it, ordinary working people felt Blair did nothing for them, but an awful lot of people through PFI deals and huge public sector jobs and big bosses. Actually, it was the rich who, I think, view Tony Blair as a hero.
Exactly, and more than that, he was just an actor. He was a complete actor. I saw him standing at the coffin of King Hussein of Jordan. It was him, Clinton, someone else, and they were trying to outdo each other in terms of miserliness. And I thought, he's this policeman. He's trying to put on this.
I tell you what, Freddie. I tell you what, Freddie. If you're right, and he was an actor, I'll tell you something. He was a very good one. 20 years since Tony Blair won a landslide, dramatic victory back in 1997. Because that wasn't the only victory he had. He won 3 general elections. And he then resigned in 2007. Yes, besmirched by the Iraq War. But he resigned that apart, at the top of his game, and handed over the poison chalice to Gordon Brown, because a year later, the financial markets collapsed and we finished up having to bail out the banks and much else. So the one thing you've got to say about Blair, if, as our caller before the break said, he was just an actor, well, he was a very, very good one. And his sense of timing in getting out was astonishing. It was once said by Enoch Powell that all political careers end in failure unless cut off in midstream. And Blair got out at the right time. And now he's hinted pretty strongly today that he might come back. Fascinating. Fire on Facebook says Blair is the best. We need him back. Nicola says Blair must take responsibility for the Iraq disaster. A lot of people think that. But he doesn't, does he? He says he had the intelligence. He apologises that it was wrong. He did what he thought was right. Tina says Blair wanted multicultural Britain. Now we have an overcrowded, divided Britain. Hi, Nigel. I never voted for Blair, and I don't want him back in any form. He ruined our country and caused a lot of heartache to many. That's from Anne in Blackburn. Good evening, Nigel. I'm wondering why Blair met with Tim Farron recently. Perhaps to be his advisor on remaining, or something else. What do you think, Maggie? Maggie, I think what you got today was perhaps a coded message. And why else would you close down all of your business interests if, without having to work too hard, they're bringing you in an awful lot of money, unless you were seriously considering a return to British politics? I just wonder whether he's limbering up for something. I wonder what Danny in Woking makes of that. Danny, good evening.
Hiya, Nigel.
So what do you think?
Well, I think there's 2 things that I reckon Tony's thinking about when he's talking about returning to politics. I think the first thing is, obviously, with the Brexit vote, there's a whole lot of people concerned about immigration, and it seems that the right are winning the debate in this country. I'm sure that's music to your ears, that the right are winning the debate in this country. And I think what he'll want to do when he sort of returns to politics is ensure that the middle ground, as people call it, doesn't shift further to the right. That all the debate is focused on the sort of Islam immigration type debate, and that we talk about other things, even though that is the pressing issue at the moment.
But Danny, don't you think the old left-right debate's a bit out of the window these days?
No, I don't think so. I think it still has huge relevance. I mean, what we've got at the moment, very clearly, is we've got someone on the left who the right call a dinosaur, and someone on the right who the left call a fascist. And I don't agree with that, obviously, but certain people in the left do say those sort of things. And I think there is a clear... I think whether or not it's necessarily left and right, there is a clear stark divide in opinion in this country. And I think what Blair wants to do is to say, hang on, we can sort of reconsider here, we can bring it back to where it was 10 years ago. And that's fine, but the issue is, as someone who's sort of a Labour supporter, who is a Labour member, the issue is, for me, is right before a general election, I'm more to the centre than the Labour Party currently is. But does that mean that I want Tony Blair saying, do not vote for Corbyn because it's going to be a disaster? Essentially...
he didn't do that, did he? Come on, let's be fair. I mean, I know it was pretty lukewarm, but he did say, I want people to vote Labour. I mean, it was through gritted teeth, Danny, I grant you. But he wasn't
I'm
being...
I'm talking about the possibilities if he does return of what he's thinking and what his actions will be. Because
Danny,
I love Tony Blair, but I don't think that...
Danny, let's put this to you. Let's say the current opinion polls are right. Let's say Theresa May wins a majority of 150. That the Labour Party has its sort of worst ever performance since the 1930s, right? Yeah. In those circumstances, would you, as somebody who says and self-declares to be more towards the centre than the current Labour Party is under Corbyn, would you want Blair back as your leader?
I don't think that we could have Blair back as our leader, simply because the Labour Party is, or proclaims to be, the party of the working class. And I think what Blair what Blair did was a very admirable thing in saying, you know, we have to appeal to the working class, but we have to appeal to the middle class as well. And I think it's not. There's a balance between policy and personality, obviously, and politics. And the thing is with Blair is that a lot of his policies were fantastic. I mean, things about extra teachers, support staff in the NHS, all that kind of stuff. But you can't be...
But that's fine, Danny. But isn't the point?
His image
isn't the point that amongst that working class base, a lot of them defected to UKIP. A lot of them, even though Corbyn may be more on the left, but a lot of them do not find his sort of North London intellectual socialism appealing in any way at all. Yeah. And actually, isn't the Labour Party's real problem that whether it's Corbyn leading it or Blair leading it, that working class vote just doesn't connect anymore with Labour?
That's what I was going to say, is Blair might have a lot of policies that did actually work for working class people, but it's very much overshadowed by immigration, the Iraq War,
absolutely,
and also the personality debate, in that I don't think that Blair could rescue the Labour Party simply because of what his public image is. I think if they found a new, fresh candidate from wherever they could find it that had the same sort of policy and personality as Blair, but wasn't actually so dodgy, if you don't mind me using that word in a way, because that's what people think he is.
Well, they do, I'm afraid. No, I think, Danny, he broke down trust. Whatever people said about John Major, they never called him a liar. And actually, after the Iraq War, people called Blair a liar, and I think there was a breakdown of trust, Danny. And I also think that with Campbell and Mandelson, they ushered in an area of spin where it all became style over substance. And look at this general election today. I mean, amazing, isn't it? When the Prime Minister is asked what she thought about a mugwump, and she says, what this country needs is strong and stable leadership, not a coalition of chaos. And that was the politics, Danny, that Blair, Campbell and Mandelson gave us. I thank you for your call. Clive says to me on Facebook, Blair was one of the most successful premiers of the 20th century. No recessions, massive school building with hospital expansions. Commentators on the far left are deluded. Yes, Clive, the recession started a year after he'd resigned. I wonder whether he saw it coming. And as for hospital expansion, done under PFI deals, which made a lot of people in the private sector benefit hugely out of the National Health Service and have left many of our hospitals with such massive repayments they're struggling to provide basic patient care today. I'm going to ask Chris in Isleworth whether he thinks Blair made this country a better place.
I think he did, Nigel. Well, you say PFI was a failure, but still...
Disaster.
But the NHS, the best sort of user satisfaction was under Blair. He brought up the hospitals, the buildings and the infrastructure. They had funding. They didn't have any doctor strikes under him. Now we're getting them.
Yeah, but Chris, and you're right, a deal was cut with the GPs, particularly with Blair, where their pay increased massively, and they were very, very happy indeed. But, I mean, isn't it ironic that it is the Labour Party who set the National Health Service up, who still at every election say, you've got to vote Labour because we founded the National Health Service. Wouldn't privatisation be awful? Actually, in lots of ways, Blair not only privatised chunks of the National Health Service, but encouraged a lot of private finance to make huge sums of money out of the rebuilding of those hospitals.
He used public finance. He used the private finances, but he would never in his life ever trying to privatise it. And
Chris, they did. The Labour years saw 5% of National Health Services outsourced to private companies.
No. The National Health was always safe under Tony Blair, and it's always safe under Labour. And I want to take you back on one thing. Don't mock Tony Blair about his business finances.
I didn't.
Because you did. You said, he's made a lot of money. But at least
he's done very well.
Yes, and he's run them successfully.
So why, Chris? Oh, fine. Look, I wasn't mocking him. I said
you were mocking him,
No, I wasn't. I said he's done extremely well. But what I did say, Chris, that fascinates me is why, when you've set that network up, and when you've got that level of income, coming in, well, you can go and give a speech in, Azerbaijan or whatever it is, or America, and get 100,000 quid for doing it. Why would you close all of that down unless actually you really were seriously thinking of a return to politics? And Chris, I think he is going to come back to British politics after this election, but my suspicion is that it won't be through the Labour Party, because I don't think the current Labour membership would have him.
It's a pity they wouldn't, but I think, Nigel, you're a businessman. You know it. What other prime minister or major political party is going to do a speech for free? Your friend Trump will do a lot more.
No, Chris, we're not knocking it. Blair went off and made tens of millions. All right, fine. Blair is an incredibly capable and able person. Chris, when he was president in office for 6 months of the European Union for the last 6 months of 2005, I spent a lot of time with him at lunches, breakfast, dinners, briefings, chats, face-to-face debates. In fact, I'm one of the few people who's ever made Tony Blair shout, and he shouted at me quite loudly at a public meeting in Christmas 2005. Chris, I do not for 1 minute, Chris, doubt this man's ability. I don't. I think in terms of a performer, he's the best we've seen in modern times. What I doubt is whether he was a success as a Prime Minister, and I don't think he was, and I think he did break down trust between voters and politics and brought a new form of cynicism in.
No, he made change for good. Everyone always goes back to Iraq. What about Bosnia? He went in there and saved those Muslims in that country when no one else wanted to help them.
Well, the problem was that it was the perceived success of Bosnia that led him, I think, to believe that he was invincible in terms of foreign and military policy. And after that, there was no stopping him. It's Bank Holiday Monday, and a lot of you are sitting in motor cars, coming back from a day out at the seaside. You've got wet waterproofs and boots in the back, and many of you probably haven't listened to this show before. But I'm here every night from Monday through Thursday, and I'm happy to take on people who support what I've done in the past or who despise what I've done in the past. And, of course, I suppose the main area for me has been the European Union. And whilst we're discussing tonight, 20 years on, whether Blair was a success or a failure, difficult not to make a comment about the reports that have appeared in a German newspaper. And this is a phone conversation that has taken place between Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the European Commission, the man who every month comes to the European Parliament and sits in seat number 21, and I sit in seat number 20. So I've got to know the bloke quite well over the years. And he said to Merkel that the dinner with Theresa May in number 10 Downing Street was all a bit of a disaster. He said Mrs May is living in another galaxy and deluding herself. He was even rude about the food, playing to a sort of classic European stereotype of what the Brits are. And, you know, one thing that we learn from this is that no negotiations with these people will ever take place in secret, and that we're not dealing, frankly, with honourable people. They are not prepared to play this with a straight bat. And I think it's a big lesson, an object lesson to Mrs May, that actually anything that is said in private will be briefed out. They are kind of stuck in this mindset. They're stuck in this mentality that says that whatever happens, they mustn't be nice to the Brits. Well, history tells us when they're rude about us and abusive about us, it makes us even more determined. But back to Mr Blair. And Mr Blair, who has hinted strongly today that he intends to return to British politics. He's closed down his business interests. Steve on Facebook says, the UK needs Blair to bring us back together again to fight the modern-day threats. Robert says, Blair created the situation for bankruptcy and then bailed out just before it went wrong. Well, he did get out spectacularly well in 2007 before everything hit the fan in 2008. I'm going to ask Steve in Stanmore, did Tony Blair make this country better, Steve?
No, Nigel.
Right.
I did vote for him in his first term of office.
Yes.
I cried with tears of joy, believing that he was going to create, remember he said, working for a fairer Britain?
Yes.
Then if you noticed in the next two terms, they dropped that phrase to Britain is working. Yes. His legacy is, after 13 years' rule, if you don't take the low wage, we'll get someone in from Poland.
Well, he did say today, actually, that they slightly underestimated the numbers that would come because the official figure was 13,000 a year.
Yes.
But to be fair, the mass immigration that Tony Blair gave us didn't just come from the European Union, because as many people came to Britain from outside the European Union as came from within.
Yeah, I must admit, I'm just using that as a...
Sure.
Not personally against Poles, but just as a phrase of, you know, as you know, it was... People questioned that the Poles were the first that people in this country noticed.
So is to you, Steve, is immigration and the change in people's incomes, is that his biggest failure?
Yes.
It is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think
absolutely.
Even bigger than Iraq?
Yeah. No, that's not an issue for me.
Right, okay.
Not an issue in any shape or form. It's uncontrolled, and I qualify that phrase, uncontrolled, like you do yourself, uncontrolled immigration.
Yes.
They did not plan. We have got a housing shortage, where the NHS is stretched, and I blame Tony Blair for the mess that this country is in.
Steve, that point couldn't be clearer. Thank you. Douglas is calling from Denmark. So, Blair, 20 years on, success or failure, Douglas?
Well, I think it's a question of personal taste. If I can be a bit frank and say, let's be optimistic and say the majority of people believed he did a good job. I'll put that to one side. The point I wanted to make was, I've lived in Denmark for 10 years. I still follow politics very closely. And I served in Iraq in 2005.
Yep.
I had no problem with doing that. And obviously it's debate about the weapons of mass destruction. And that's part of the package as a soldier. You do your duty. So I'm very proud to have a medal on my chest. My point is this. I think it's extremely unacceptable now that Blair comes out and says, well, the people who were voted to leave, they still didn't know what they were voting for. And that's what I find quite disgusting, to be honest.
Do you? Go on, why?
Well, because how can you on the one hand, talk badly about the people who voted to say they still didn't know what they were voting for, it's still not late to stop Brexit, but on the other hand, you can accept the fact that people like me and thousands of other men and women will happily serve on his behalf in the army. And I think that's the irony of the situation.
So he sort of really has his own form of democracy, doesn't he? That he likes some results, but if it doesn't go his way, he disrespects it, and effectively says sort of either we've all been conned or we're all stupid.
Absolutely. I think it would be a step backwards if he returns to British politics.
Douglas, again, another caller whose point couldn't be clearer, and thank you. Nigel, the return of Tony Blair, he has the charisma of a double-glazing salesman. Every time I see or hear Blair, I think past the sick bucket, says Roger in Ruislip, very helpfully. Well, Roger, like it or not, I think he's limbering for a comeback, and perhaps a big one, if Labour do very badly in this election on the 8th of June. Conrad in Bristol. Was he good for the country? Was he bad for the country? Was he a bit of both?
Well, good evening, Nigel. It's lovely to speak to you. I'm an enormous fan. What I would say is this. He did have some successes on domestic policy. He did some things which were very good for this country. He was undoubtedly an enormous success in the brand of politics that he brought forward, keeping those sort of Thatcherite free market economics, but at the same time... Isn't
it ironic, Conrad? Isn't it ironic that we're getting people ringing up saying Blair was a really good Thatcherite?
Well, yeah, it's funny. It's true, of course. I studied politics. It could not be truer that he bought into that brand of politics. The fact that he got people like my father, who's an investment banker who works for Goldman Sachs, to vote for him over and over again. He became a Labour Party donor. That sort of tells part of the story. But then we look at things like Iraq, the European Union. He should have offered this country a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty. He should have done that. I mean, obviously that came to Gordon Brown because he stepped down slightly before that. But the fact is he willfully deceived the British people with the Lisbon Treaty. On immigration, he didn't have a clue what he was doing. The underestimates of how many people would come here from Eastern Europe, that was a total disaster to this country. And undoubtedly Iraq. I mean, that is the biggest one for me. I mean, how many people died over there in Iraq? I mean, just an absolute disaster. I recently watched the documentary The Killings of Tony Blair by George Galloway. And, if you watch that, it could not be clearer. I mean, I understand that is a bit biased, but it's a very, very compelling case.
I mean, George does have a very strong point of view.
Yeah, of course, but it's a very compelling case, and you see people like David Davis, the Brexit secretary, talking in there. It's a very compelling case. Yeah.
So, Conrad, you said your father became a Labour donor, and if you asked him what was Blair's biggest success, what would he say? Do you think?
Well, I really do struggle with that because I don't. I mean, we don't get along at all. I'm sort of a conservative, but I also lean towards UKIP, whereas he is very much a Blairite man. So we sort of have. There's a big disagreement.
Don't discuss politics at Sunday lunch, Conrad. Is that really the lesson from this?
That's very reasonable. Yeah, exactly. I really struggle to understand, but I think ultimately, as a banker, I think he must look at Blair and think that his biggest successes are on the economy. But what he doesn't seem to understand, what I think, is that his economic policies were really Thatcherite economic policies, and that begs the question: why aren't you a conservative then?
Yeah, and then, of course, at the end of his time, we saw Cameron and Osborne leading the opposition and actually willingly describing themselves as heir to Blair. So it was politics had come so much to the centre that it was actually quite difficult to work out who was on the left, who was on the right, and we finished up with the politics, I think, of very little choice. And I suspect that the rise of the SNP and the rise of UKIP and the rise of single-issue politics is actually as a direct result of what Blair did, because we stopped having proper choices in elections. Conrad, fascinating call. Kyle in Norwich, did he make this a better country or a worse one?
I think, in all fairness, he's made an absolute worse one. I mean, every dog has a day, and I think you can apply that doctrine to prime ministers. And quite frankly, the way he handled the Iraq war is unforgivable, and I think he can't redeem himself from this. And if he's going to return to politics, then he's got another thing coming. No one is ever going to have him back, whether you're Conservative or Labour, and I think he's an absolute disgrace of a person.
Wow, strong opinion, but he sees himself, I think, a bit like General de Gaulle did in France when he sort of went into his sort of period of isolation down in Lorraine and waited for the country to call him back. And I think what Blair is hinting at is that there isn't anybody out there in the Remainer camp who frankly has the stature to lead a really big fight back on this. And I think he sees himself as a British de Gaulle. That's what I think, Carl.
Yeah. I remember just a little while ago you touched on Juncker. I mean, I'm a pro-Brexit conservative, but I'm sick to the back teeth of Juncker talking to the British public like he does and undermining everything we do. He's the face of the European Union. No wonder why people don't like them. No wonder why the whole
because they're bullies, and they're thugs. And I called them. I said the other week in Parliament that I thought they were behaving like the mafia. I said, you're demanding a ransom from us as if we're hostages. We're not. We're a free country. And I got ticked off by the President of the European Parliament, who was Italian. I said, well, I'm very sorry if I've used the word mafia, and I apologise for any cultural sensitivities. I'll just call you a bunch of gangsters instead. And
just know this, Nigel, I'm 100% behind you in what you do. I think you're a fantastic person. Keep on doing what you're doing.
Carl,
you've got my full support.
You're very kind. Thank you very much indeed. Well, I've had some interactions with Tony Blair. I've seen this business of style and substance and result, and I'll talk about that. 20 years ago, the music was playing, things could only get better, the sun was shining, thousands of people were thronging Downing Street, and if you watch the BBC, it was like the second coming of the Lord. And 20 years on, we're analysing, did he make the country a better or a worse place? My main interaction with him was in the last half of 2005, when he was, for 6 months, the president of the European Council, the rotating 6-month presidency. And I think my experience with him during that time said everything. He was, at all times, utterly charming. He displayed a very good sense of humour, of that was no doubt, and at times a self-deprecating sense of humour. He would stand up, and I'd see him in Brussels, but equally in the House of Commons. He'd stand up and tell a joke against himself if things hadn't gone very well, and the public rather liked that, and he was good at that and clever at that. But so he arrived in Brussels, and he was deeply unpopular because of the Iraq War. He walked into a hostile European Parliament. He gave a 35, 40-minute speech without any notes. It finished with a huge standing ovation. He was a star. He was a brilliant performer. I think actually in political terms, the best that I've ever seen. He then launched upon this project of saying, in his 6 months, he was going to reform the European Union, and in particular, the common agricultural policy. This is what he was going to do. And at the end of that 6 months, and it was the week of Christmas, and it was the very last meeting of the governments, and they were up all night, literally up all night. And Blair walked in to a press briefing with MEPs, and I could see he basically hadn't been to bed at all. He looked haggard. The Foreign Office looked embarrassed. Mind you, throughout their history, they often look embarrassed because they get almost everything wrong. And he gave this press conference, having just given away £7 billion of the British rebate in return for no reform of the agricultural policy at all, but the French promising they might have a look at it in a few years' time. And I said to him in my little intervention, I said, look, unlike you, President Chirac actually stands up for his national interest. I said, and he's outclassed you and outplayed you at every twist and turn. And in response, he went absolutely puce. And he pointed his finger at me and he shouted, this isn't 1945. We're not at war with these people anymore. They're our friends. And I think I'm the only person he's ever actually shouted at. And what we're going to do is on lbc.co.uk, after this show, we will put those clips up so that you can watch that and see it. It's a long time ago, 2005. What I learned from it was that when it comes to style, when it comes to presentation, no one better than Blair, certainly not in my lifetime. When it comes to delivery, I think it's all been rather disappointing. But there we are. John says Tony Blair's university policies dumb down the educational system. Michelle says Tony Blair, globalist puppet and promoter of the New World Order. Joan feels even more strongly. She says Blair spent our money in war, got a lot of innocent people killed, and he should be prosecuted. That's strong stuff. I wonder what Darren in Knightsbridge thinks. Do you think he was a success, Darren? And should he make a dramatic return to British politics?
I look forward to those videos, Nigel. Public enemy number one, Tony Blair, a globalist and a professional corporate lobbyist. I don't trust him. I don't believe he's given up last time I checked, he was earning £37,000 a day from two big banks. I don't believe that he's just given that up. I believe he's still be working for them in some capacity. So I believe that that's what how we should look at him these days. And of course, the other thing that he's doing, he's like there's a pattern here, Nigel. Every time we get around the table and talk about something important, he always chips in. He's been doing it quite regularly. The reason he does that is he's trying desperately to rebrand the Tony Blair the Tony Blair name. Ever since the revelations a few months ago about his despot spin doctrine work that he did, his brand has completely collapsed. So that's his motivation here. He has no loyalty to this country, to any political party. He doesn't even have a loyalty to Europe. And I've got a question for you, Nigel.
Yep.
When Greece was brought into the European Union and it had no money and it really shouldn't have been a player, but it was convinced to borrow money from big American banks, was it Tony Blair who was the broker that he was the one that was doing the business there between the European Union and these big banks? And
I doubt that, Darren. I doubt that very much indeed, because Greece actually joined the European Union back in 81, I think it was. But when Greece joined the Euro, Blair was the British Prime Minister, and I very much doubt he would have played a brokerage role in that. But what Blair believed then and believes now is that the Euro was a good thing, and he was desperate to get the United Kingdom to join the Euro. And thank goodness we didn't. So if he was wrong about the biggest economic decision this country's had to take post-1945, why would we trust his view now, Darren?
Exactly. And of course there's the other thing that's been in the papers but not in the media high profile is this recent Attorney General case. They're blocking a court case against him from an aggression claim of a crime, and it's our country.
Darren, you know, we have to be careful about some of this stuff, but I do take it you feel very strongly about Blair, as indeed does James, who texts me. Blair's legacy is that he has destroyed trust in politics in this country. I kind of was heading a bit, James, in that direction earlier, wasn't I? I'm going to ask Robert in Basildon, is this country a better place 20 years on from Blair's election?
Hello, Mr. Farage. It's an absolute pleasure being on your show for a start. I do believe that Blair was a good Prime Minister. I sincerely believe that. For a start, he was very pro-factory economics as another...
This is hilarious, Robert. It's really very, very funny, but go on, keep going.
Well, for a start, he was economically on the right and socially on the left. For me, that mix is not a good one. As for economics, I do believe that he was a good Prime Minister. Socially, no. He dragged us into the Iraq War, which turned out to be an absolute disaster and sparked what we still have today, many years later, of course. And he gave light to the opposition that is Labour. Obviously, that's been torn down by Jeremy Corbyn today. However, he did revitalise Labour. With the new Labour movement, he finally gave hope to the opposition. And again, we were arguably a democracy because we had a strong opposition. And a strong opposition is, of course, important to democracy.
Well, he put together, Robert, the most phenomenal election machine any of us have seen in our lifetimes. They were very, very good at it, weren't they?
Definitely. But I do believe that he revitalised Westminster and that he gave the opposition a new breath of fresh air. Today, he's kind of gone off the radar for, so many years now. And so for him suddenly popping up and trying to introduce himself back into politics is, in my opinion, an absolute mistake. He's going to get dragged through the mud a million times. He's going to get called a war criminal and all these other things.
A bit like the heavyweight boxer who's spent all his money and decides to make a comeback and gets knocked out. Unlike our new heavyweight champion Joshua, who, wow, if any of you saw it at the weekend, it was something special. Robert, I thank you. James in Harrogate, did Blair make this a better or worse country?
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
I think he was potentially the worst person that's ever happened to this country. He opened up the borders without asking. If we'd said yes, fair enough, but he didn't ask us. He sent all the kids to university to study colleges, giving them false hope, people from working class backgrounds. They weren't necessarily academic. They all studied analogy. They came out, 3-4 years later with 20-25 grand worth of debt, working in bars alongside Eastern Europeans who had just come across. People don't actually understand with the PFI deals how much he indebted this country with what he did. People don't actually. I know David Cameron. I know what he did in 2012. People need to understand how Cameron opened up the National Health Service, but it all started with Tony Blair, carried on by Cameron, and the demographic changes, the amount of people who have left London and moved up to, say, Yorkshire or Manchester because, there were 11, different languages being spoken in schools. I mean, the demographic changes, he compressed wages with open door immigration. The working classes, I suppose he helped Eastern Europe. I suppose he helped.
He didn't only give them jobs, but he was also very happy, as those of you that watch the clip after the show will see. I said to him, why are you sending taxpayers' money to rebuild the underground system in Warsaw when our Victorian system is creaking at the fringes? James, you've read out a very long charge sheet against Tony Blair. I would say as a final thought, look, make no mistake about it, in terms of being a political speaker and an operator, and in terms of building an image, there's nobody been better in my lifetime. But this victory of style over substance and the introduction of spin to British politics, I think, brought a whole new level of cynicism to politics. And in the end, I think broke down trust. Is he going to come back? Well, this Labour Party, with its current membership, wouldn't have him. So is he going to come back after the election like Roy Jenkins in 1981 and launch a new social democratic party? I don't know. Be jolly exciting if he did.